Hey guys, welcome to the next video. So this time we're going to make a notification pop up whenever we pick up or drop an item. Now there's quite a few things to consider with notifications. One is where it's positioned on the screen, whether it's all text or has symbols, how long it stays up for, and whether the notifications stack together. So you can see my notifications always start from this point here. It's just text, but you could add graphics if you wanted. And they stay up for about 1.5 seconds before fading away and then destroying themselves. But if at any time the notification updates, the countdown kind of resets. So if the player picks up a lot of items all at once, they're going to need additional time to read it all. So now we have to consider how we're going to go about storing the information about our notifications. So I am going to use a data structure again, right? So we're going to use a grid. So it's going to have 2 columns and then however many rows for the number of notifications. So each row is kind of going to be a new notification. So it could be +1 tomato, -2 potatoes, or whatever. So in this first column, we store the number that the notification is. So this could be a positive or a negative number if we're gaining or losing a certain number of items. And then in the second column, we have the name of the item. And we're actually going to pull this from our item info grid that we created in the previous video. So for example, we could have a series of notifications if we've just crafted, let's say, an axe. So we could have -1 stone, -3 wood, and then we gain +1 axe. And then what's going to happen is our notification object is just going to loop through this data structure, however big it is, so however many entries it has, and then it's going to draw all of them. All right, so let's get started. So let's come into our objects and we're going to create a new object, and we'll do it in this tab because it's not really a being in our world, it's sort of an item that only the player will get to see. So let's call it OBJ notification, and let's get it set up. Let's start doing the fading of the notification. So what I'm going to have is I'm going to basically set an alarm to go off in 1 or 2 seconds, and that is going to flip kind of a switch and tell the notification to start reducing the alpha of the notifications, and then once it hits 0, it's going to destroy this entire object. So this object is only ever going to be in the game for as long as the notifications are there. So let's create some variables. I'm going to have fade away, and we're going to start that off as being false. And we make that true when the alarm goes off. We're going to have something to store the alpha that we're on. So notification alpha, NOT alpha. So this is going to start at 1, of course, because that is full alpha. And basically we're just going to reduce this when fade away is true. And finally, we're going to set an alarm. So we haven't created this alarm event yet, but I'm just going to type it in. So alarm 0, and we'll tell it to go off after, I'm just going to put 1.5 seconds. So just as a reminder, when you set an alarm like this, it's going to want the number of steps, not the actual seconds. And the reason I've just put room speed is because room speed is going to be the number of steps in 1 second. So this is going to be 60, and 60 times 1.5 is going to get us 90, and that's the number of steps that the alarm is going to go off after. So let's actually just create that alarm. So alarm 0. And the only thing this alarm is going to do is toggle fade away to be true. Now let's create the variable that's going to store our grid data structure. So I'm going to call this DS notifications, and I'm actually just going to set this to -1 for now. So I'm not actually going to create it, because what's going to happen is if there are no OBJ notifications currently in the world, so if we just pick up a tomato after a while, it's going to go ahead and create this notification, create the data structure, and then slot in 1 tomato. And then if we pick up something relatively soon after that, it's going to detect that there's a notification already, and it's just going to add itself to the grid. And that's going to all be done externally. So this object isn't actually going to create it itself. Right, another thing I'm just going to set is the font that we're going to use for the notifications. So I had a font called FNT Text 24. I'm just going to use that one. All right, now we can assume that if this object is being created, we are actually going to create a data structure. So we should still go ahead and prepare to clean it up, to destroy it. Because GameMaker does not do this by itself. You have to do your own waste disposal. So let's just go if the data structure exists. It should, but it's always good to check. So if this exists, ds grid destroy. Now we can actually go ahead and do our code for drawing the grid. So we're going to have to make this work for any size grid, so however many rows there are. All right, so for the fade away, all we need to say is just if fade away. So if this is true, you could put equals true, or you could just leave it like this. Then we're going to reduce our notification alpha variable by, I'm just going to do 0.1. And then if we hit 0, so if the notification alpha is less than or equal to 0, then we're going to destroy this object. Now let's do the drawing. And we're going to structure this in a very similar way to what we've done for all of the other data structures. We're going to have a repeat statement and we're going to be looping through the grid. So let's make a variable for the grid. I'm going to call this not grid. So I'm going to make this equal to ds notifications. I'm going to get the height of the grid because that's the number of times we are going to need to loop through the grid. That's how many notifications we have to draw. So we get the height of the notification grid. And now we do our repeat statement. So yy equals 0, and then we repeat grid height, and of course increment yy every time. So now we're going to draw text, and let's do color so that we can specify the color of the notifications. And this will probably be a long line, so I'll do it over a couple lines. So now we need a location for our notifications. So you could put this wherever you want. I'm going to basically just put in some hard numbers. So I'm going to put it kind of over to the very left of the screen and kind of in the middle. So I'm actually going to get the height of the GUI layer. So let's just get the GUI height, display get GUI height. And we want to have this outside of the repeat statement because we don't need to get this multiple times every frame. In fact, we don't even need to be getting it in this event. We could put this straight into the create event because we only need to find that once. So for the X, I'm just going to put 100. And then for the Y, we are going to do, so in the middle of the screen, so the GUI height over 2. And now depending on what YY is currently equal to, we want to change the height of the notification. So I'm going to add YY, and then we need some kind of buffer room. Because just this YY isn't going to be enough. This is just going to bump us up 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 pixels. We need to probably times this by some number. So you could put in a hard number relative to your font size, so maybe 20 or 30. I might actually make a variable in here called str height. So this is the height of the string, and then we're actually going to get the string height of just a letter, and this is just going to give us the height of a string of whatever the font is currently set to in pixels. So if we just draw set font, this font here, it's going to get us just the height of a generic string. And because this is in the capital, this should be kind of the max height of what the string could be. And that is how much I'm going to separate my strings. So this way, if I change my font later, it's still going to work. All right, now in addition to this, so this one is getting a little bit complicated, but I'm actually also going to raise the entire notification by whatever this number is times this. And the reason I'm doing that is so when the notification appears, the notification that is kind of down the bottom is always the last notification. So the one that's going to be down the very bottom is actually the last one in the grid because that one is going to be at the same value as grid height. So if we put this up by that amount, they're going to go down the screen starting at different values depending on how big the grid is. So again, you could play with this kind of thing to get different effects for your notifications. I'd highly recommend that, but this is just how I'm going to do it. So I might actually put that onto another line so that we can see it. So this was our X value, this is the Y. All right, so the next thing we have to do is give it the actual string to print. And that we have to grab from our grid, so our notification grid. So we give the X value as column 1, so that would be column 0 actually, the first column. And then the Y value is whatever YY is. So this will get us that number in the grid. But since it's a number, we should convert this to a string because right now it's just a real value. And I actually want to add our name for the item. So that would be the same thing. We can just copy paste it, except have this be in column 1, so the second column. And now we need the color of this text. So I might just have a value up here, C, and I'm just going to set it to white. So I'm just going to set all of those colors to white. So the alpha is going to be not just a number, it's actually going to be whatever this is, so that as the alpha is reducing, we will get this to fade away. Now, one final thing I'm actually going to add to the text is the sign of the notification. So remember, I'm going to do it so that if you are gaining an item, there's going to be a plus, but if you're losing an item, there's going to be a minus. So the minus will actually already be there because this number will just be negative. But if it's a positive number, we're not going to get a plus appearing. So I'm going to add a plus if, so this value right here, so if this value is greater than 0, so if it's a positive number, then we want to draw something here. And I'm going to do this in the form of a variable. So I'm going to create a variable here called notification sign. Right, so by default, I'm just going to make this an empty string. And we're only going to change this if we find this to be true. So in the case that it's negative, we're actually going to add this to the string. But of course, it's going to be adding nothing. So nothing's going to change. But if this is a positive number, then we're going to change notification sign to be a plus. All right, and let's just be careful with our brackets here. So it's complaining and we've got an extra bracket. There we go. All right, so we are done with the notifications. We can quit out of this object and let's head over to our item object, because we are now going to create this notification when an item is being picked up. So we're in the step event of our item object. Let's revisit the code where we are being picked up. So here was when we start chasing the player, and here is where we're being picked up. So right here, we had if we are being picked up, and that was when we were destroying the item. And we can put in our creation of the notification right here. So I'm going to wrap this in a region. We can keep things nice and organized. So we're going to create a notification. We will end the region there. All right, and now this is going to get a little hairy. Let's make sure we've got plenty of room. Okay, now the first thing we do is just check. So if our notification object exists or not. So if it doesn't exist, so instance exists, obj notification, then I'm going to create it. So this is in the case that it doesn't exist. So we go instance, create layer. Now the location of the instance's object itself doesn't really matter. So I'm just going to put it at 0, 0. I'll put it in the instances layer for now, but we might move it if we have a GUI layer or something. And the type of object is obj notification. All right, and we close off that bracket. So that's the first thing we do. Now we have to add a notification. So we're going to have to go with that notification object. Now we could get the specific ID of the notification that we're creating, but there should only ever be one of these, which is why we've done the check here. So it is safe to do it this way in this case. So now we need another check to see if the notification grid already exists. And we're going to do things slightly differently depending on if it exists or not. So let's say if DS exists, DS notifications of DS type grid. So if that exists, actually, let's say if it doesn't exist, then we create it. That is going to be the shorter case. And then otherwise we do other stuff. So in this case, we're going to create the grid, right? And this is the first time it's being created. So we know that the dimensions are just going to be width of 2. It's always going to have a width of 2. And the height is just going to be 1, right? And we can go ahead and then just add ourselves to the grid. So let's just go and create a temporary variable for our DS notifications and then add ourselves. So in the very first column on the first row, so that is where we want to add the number. And then for the second one, we want to add the name of the item. So to do this, we need some information about the item. We know that the number is just going to be 1 because this is the first time it's being created, but we don't know what the item number is. So let's zoom up a little bit and see if we actually do have this information here. And we do, we have it right here in the item number. That's a variable that we created in obj item. So it has what kind of item it is. So we can use this, or actually this thing right here. So I'm actually just going to copy this and put the same thing right here. So right before we go into the with statement, so that now we can access it from within here. So now we have to pull actually the name of the item from the inventory's DS items info grid. So remember, that's where we were storing all of the names. So we go inventory, DS items info. And just to remind you of how we were storing everything, let's jump back to it. So we had the name of the item in the first column. So we can say column 0 and then whatever the item number was. All right, so now we're ready to move on to our next case, right? So this was creating the grid. So now we're going to do similar things here. So we can grab this. But the first thing we're going to need to do when we add a new item to the grid, so this is going to be the second or any other notification that we add, we're going to have to see if the item type that we are is already in the grid. So if we have already created a tomato notification, then we actually already have a row dedicated to us, so we just want to change that number. But if we do not have a tomato already, so if there's a carrot notification that was the first one that got created, and now we're adding one tomato, then we do need to resize the grid. So we need to loop through the grid and check if there's any items that go by our name. So we're going to have to loop through the grid. So I'm going to grab this. We're also going to need the height of the grid. And then we need to loop through it. Right, so we repeat by the grid height and then remember to increment YY every time. Now we need to check. So if our name, so actually we need to get the name firstly of this item. So I'm just going to call this name. So if that name is equal to, so our notification grid, and we're going to be checking the second column, so column 0, 1, to see as we loop through if we spot our name somewhere. So if we do, then all we're going to have to do is on this spot of the notification grid, we're just going to add ourselves. So we're going to add 1 to that current count. And then we can break out of this because we don't need to check any additional spots. But otherwise, we need some way of saying that if we go through this entire loop and then we find that this is never true, we need some way of saying we weren't actually in the grid, we need to be added. So to do that, I'm going to have a variable up here called inGrid. I'm going to set this to false. And then as we're looping through, if we find that we are actually in the grid, then we're going to make this true. But if this never runs, then this is still going to be false. And we can just do a check here. If we're not in the grid, then we know that we made it through that loop and we never found an item of our type. Now, we need to resize the grid to make room for a new type of entry. And for our width, it's still going to be 2. But our height is going to be, so whatever the current grid height is, just plus 1. Right, so just reusing that variable that we got from before. So we've resized it. Now we can just slot ourselves in just like before. So just like up here. In fact, we might as well just take this, copy paste here. And because we know we were not currently in the grid, we do know that this is just going to be an equals 1. This will be the first in it as opposed to up here when we were adding to whatever was there. And again, like before, we add our name. Except this isn't going to be spot 0. In fact, it'll be at whatever the new height that we created is, but minus 1. So remember, if the grid has, let's just say 2 rows, the grid height is going to be 2, but the number of that row is going to be 0, 1. That's the last one. So it's always going to be whatever the grid height is minus 1. So because of that, the current grid height is this variable plus 1. So if we leave off this plus 1, that's actually going to be the spot that we want. So we can just put grid height. All right. So that is pretty much it. The only thing that we haven't done is add something so that if we are adding a new notification to the grid, we stop the notification from fading away. And in fact, we reset its alpha to be full so that we can read all of the new notifications. So to do that, I'm actually going to put, in our OBJ notification, I'm going to put an event, and we'll just use a user event, and I'll just use user event 0. And in here, we're going to set fade away to be false again. So this is going to mean that we're no longer going to be fading if we currently are. And I'm also going to set the alpha back to 1. And we are also going to have to reset that alarm that we set in the create event to be for another 1.5 seconds later. So I'm going to copy this and paste it here. So now all we have to do is call this whenever a new notification is added. So back in OBJ item, all we have to do is call this when we are adding to a grid. So we could do that at any time here. Might as well just do it at the top. We just say event perform. So for this function, we need to give it the type of the event. So this is actually, remember, under the other tab. So we put event other, right? Because when we create it, it's under this. And then user event, user 0. All right, so that should work. All right, so let's create a few items into the world and let's go pick them up. All right, that was a lot of code, so I'm not surprised that there was an error somewhere. And I like to leave these in just because it's always good practice to do some bug solving and maybe I'll stumble upon a common error that might help you guys out. So let's just read this one together. So it's saying on line 77 of our item, it is unable to perform this action. So let's have a think, what is in the notification grid at this point? So actually it's going to be a name is in column 1. But I have said add something to that column, which doesn't make any sense. So I've put the wrong number here. So let's abort and let's fix that up. So in obj item line 77, so we want, so not this one, but column 0. So that is where the numbers are kept. All right, try that again. Create a few items. There we go. All right, so that is working. So those were the picking up notifications, but I also want those notifications to pop up when we are losing an item. So if I'm dropping it, for example. So that code for dropping the item was actually in the inventory itself. So we need to go and find that code. So it was in the inventory object. Let's see. So that was when we were either middle clicking it or dropping an item into the game world. So let's do this one. So actually I might just make a variable because it's going to be in two places. It's going to be here when we drop an item into the game world, or down here when we middle click and we create the item. And because I don't want to just copy and paste the code into two spots, I'm actually going to just have both of them turn on a variable. So I'm going to set a variable called create notification, and it's going to be false originally. But if this happens, then we're going to make this true. And we'll do the same thing in here. All right, and now down the very bottom, we'll set up another region for create notification. Now the code is going to be very similar to the one that we had in the item. Basically, all we have to do is just make it negative. So I'm actually just going to grab it, which is all this stuff here. So what you can actually do is you can close this up and then copy this line, and it's going to copy that entire contents of the region. All right, so let's hop back to the inventory. So in here, I suppose I could just copy paste over this. And it looks like our tab has gone a bit weird. So let's just grab all of this, shift tab it back. All right, so we still need to do all of the same things. We still need to check if it exists, create it if it doesn't. We still need to get the item number, but this is where we're going to change a little bit because it's going to be different for the middle click or the pickup slot. So actually we need to do this respectively in each of these slots too. So in here, when we say create notification is true, we should also grab what kind of item it is. And we actually do that here. So I'm going to put this after this one. This is getting kind of the item type that it was from the inventory grid. So we can say instead of the item number, we'll take it from P item. And we'll need to do something similar down here in the middle click. And if we're doing the middle click, then we actually know that the item that we're getting rid of is going to be whatever this one was. So instead of P item, we're going to replace that with this here because that is where we store the item types. All right, so we've got IN in either case. Now we can come back to here. And when we're creating our notification, all of this code for the IN is still going to work. All right, so now what we need to do is just instead of whenever we're adding one, we just need to take it away. So here, instead of creating the first item, this is where we take away the first item. So we put -1. And down here, instead of adding, we just minus equals. And the same for here. Now, the only thing we need to do is just wrap this whole thing in that check to see if create notification was true. So let's go if create notification. Then we do this. All right, let's run. All right, so let's pick up something and let's drop it out. All right, good. So that's working. There's something weird happening with the font, but that is working properly. Now, the other thing that we could check, so we've got some items here. So what we could do is pick something up and drop it and see if everything is adding and taking away properly. So I'll add a few of those. And I'll suck them back in. So +4, and then if we spit them back out, yep, there we go. So everything is working. So let's just see why that font thing is happening. So in the notification, so we have to make sure that we're actually setting the font every frame. So let's just take this and add that in here. There we go. So everything seems to be working. All right, so that is it for today. So now we've done a lot of inventory stuff for the past few episodes, and it's about time that we move on to something else. there is still actually changes that I would make for the inventory. So we have huge blocks of code right now for a lot of our inventory. So especially for adding things to the inventory, we just have blocks of code, but we might want to generalize this into scripts that we can use so that we can just call, for example, add item, because you might want to do that in a quest or something when a NPC gives you an object. So later on, we might go back over all this inventory stuff and refine it a little bit and create some useful scripts. But for now, that should be everything pretty set up for the inventory. And down the track, we might also make further additions like adding some crafting or an equipment tab so that we can equip different tools. But we'll leave inventory stuff for a little bit and maybe we'll do some NPC or dialogue stuff in the coming videos. As always, I'd like to thank everyone on Patreon for supporting me to create these tutorials. And special shoutouts to Sammy Myth, Alina S, Spock 2018, Doan Techman, Thomas M, Danielle Hargrave, Ricky C, XD Game Studio, The Great Poultry, Hunter T, and Max Molinaro. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time.